Hello adventurers, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are in Dodge City, Kansas, where we are going to the infamous Boot Hill Museum. Of course, before we move into the museum portion, they have a gift shop. This is where you come to pay. I also found a patch here, and there's some other cool stuff, especially some of the things that are made here in Kansas. So we're going to be checking out a few of those and then going inside the museum.
You are here at the gift shop. We ask that you enter the double doors right there underneath the green sign. There are 12 new exhibits, and they're all interactive, so feel free to push any buttons or watch any videos that you like. There's a little shot glass that you barely raise and a video to accompany it. Then once you get to the buffalo exhibit, there's an off-colored carpet that you stand on, kind of replica of a stampede, and there's a buffalo video. Continue through the exhibit out the double doors. Then you're going to take a left, keep going past the construction that's right here, and then go up or down up the stairs or the ramps, and it leads you to the original jail. Just a little bit up from there is the Cowboy Capitol building, which has our Marshall Hall of Fame, and then in and out to the same door. And then on the side there's a little tiny pathway that goes back to the cemetery exhibit. Come back down to the stairs or through the ramp, and then into the general store, which they have some more little artifacts and then some stuff you can buy. Very and cool. Some homemade fudge. Ooh. The next door is the Long Branch Saloon, fully functioning. You can sit down, talk to the bartender if you like, and have a cool drink. We have a beer from our local brewery. And then you're going to continue through the exhibit. Let's just close. And then you're going to go to the Hardesty House, Church, and the Blacksmith. So these three buildings are all original. So you can walk through the Hardesty House and the Church. Blacksmith, you can only view through the outside.
Now, as we proceed into the museum, there's going to be different sections, and it's fully interactive, so there's tons of stuff we can do. But it's going to tell us the history of this area and proceed us all the way back to the outdoor exhibits, which include the Boot Hill Cemetery. And so this is going to be really fabulous. Again, this is a great trip through Western history, and so such a neat way to kind of see this in such an infamous town. In this first display case, as soon as we come in the door, it takes us through a brief timeline, and in this timeline you can see different things that were deposited and found in this region. I always really appreciate whenever they have Native American outfits, because you can kind of see what kind of clothing that they would have worn. Now, we've learned at many museums that the clothing that they would create were many times created from the buffalo, and they would use the entirety of the buffalo for different things around camp. In addition to some of the many pieces that are on display here, we learn about the spiritualism and how the sun, earth, rivers, sky, and rainbows were all considered to be beings by these people. They all had very specific things that they would signify to the people as they would go through life. And because of that, it was many times reflected in the things that they would carry with them or create around camp. Now, this is pretty interesting. This is actually pebble patterns is what it's called. And it says for Plains Indians, some of the games were more than just fun. In fact, they would help them to build skills for the future. Here, you pick up this little magnet and drag it across these pebbles to arrange them. And as you do so, you can create designs and see movement. Included in this display are some historic photos, and they also have some information about what is going on in each. For example, this one on the bottom is an Arapaho medicine man and his family, and you can see the structure they're sitting outside of is somewhat reflected in the room around us with this teepee structure. It allows you to see the basic overall construction of how the teepees were made, and then also inside there's a little bit more historical significance. Now, for the people of the Great Plains, the teepee structure was essential. It was easy to move and take to a different place, as they would be nomadic across the plains area looking for food and also more water. But also, This was also something that was attached to something called teepee etiquette. Did you know that there was teepee etiquette? Well, here we learn a little bit more about that. And this is one of the first places that I've been to who has tackled that subject in such an easy visual way with this little sign right here. Not only is there a quote, but there's also some information. Let's go check it out. In fact, here in both English and Spanish, you can read a little bit more about this. It says an open flap meant that friends could come in. If there were two sticks crossed over the door, that meant that the owners were away and they did not desire to have company there at that time. Despite the fact that right up here there is a quote that says, "We are all related," it didn't mean that everybody needed to be in the teepee at all times. And there were several other factors that went into the teepee etiquette as well. So I think that that's great that we can learn a little bit more about this here at the museum at Boot Hill. Along the walls of this area, we have a hand-painted mural, but amongst that, you actually have a description of which tribes would have lived in which areas. For example, where we are currently, we are within this region right here, which would have been Kiowa or Kiowa Apache. And then also, I am from an area that would have had primarily Comanche. And so by being able to see this in a more tangible way, you could see where everyone kind of started out before they were forced onto lands. When European women first saw the Native American women of this area, many of them thought that they were very subservient. They didn't think that they had a lot of power. But in reality, something that we have learned over time is that the Plains Indian women were actually the backbones of some of the communities. They had authority, more so than the European women who were judging them at that time. In fact, a chief's wife, even though she didn't garner a title herself, would have been elaborately adorned with beadwork and glasswork and things like that. People would have known who she was just by her appearance itself. Whenever the Europeans came, they didn't quite understand that, and so they just would see outwardly what was happening within the villages and think that the women must be so oppressed. But they were not. In fact, the women were a pivotal part in educating the children and keeping the tribe together. They were the moral support, they were the backbone, and the men leaned heavily on them because they had to all work in community. And I think that's really nice that they actually have this on display and talk a little bit more about that. But in addition to these fun facts, there's also quotes around the room from various tribes and tribal leaders, and something that's kind of fascinating. There's a little did you know fact as we're going into the next display. This one is really, really cool. Did you know that countless Indian words are now part of the English language? Barbecue, cannibal, chipmunk, chocolate, hammock, hurricane, mahogany, possum, potato, skunk, and woodchuck all stem from Native Americans. There are so many things that we can attribute to these Plains people, in fact, and the more that you kind of start digging into some more of the sites, the more you do learn about that. For example, many of the things that we still consume today have ties to the earliest people here in our country, which we know now or the Native Americans or the indigenous people. And so we can definitely say thank you to them for being able to learn how to maintain and grow and do some of those things. So I think that's kind of cool. But now we're moving into the next display, which is vastly different than this one. In this area, we learn about the time of many flags and the impact of European contact on this area. As you can see, this is an expansive room that has a lot of different information, but above you can see all of the many flags that came through this area. Now here we learn about the introduction of the horse. Now this is a controversial subject because to some they believe that horses were already here roaming free, but historically it has attributed horses coming to the Native American or Plains people to Coronado. Whenever he introduced them to many of the tribes, they started being able to be more efficient and hunt faster and be more streamlined and bring back more things to their tribes. However, it was only 350 years after the introduction of these horses, they ended up decimating a lot of the Plains people using the same horses. So this is one of the facts that you can learn here, and then you can go into a little bit more detail about Coronado and whenever he came to the Americas right here. Now I do find this display pretty interesting because along the way it tells you about many of the flags that have flown in this region. And in doing so, it talks about Spain and France and the United States and Mexico, and then there's Texas. But we are in Kansas. How is that something? Well, according to facts here, and also throughout history, whenever Texas won its independence from Mexico, they acquired this large chunk of land. And Texas that we know today was not the Texas that was then. In fact, it shows here that by winning that independence, they had this chunk that included all the way up to Dodge City, which is a sizable jump from that Texas border, let me tell you. But this is interesting to me because this is the first place that I've ever seen that they show that a place like Dodge City would have been considered Texas at one point. Kind of interesting being a Texan to have not known that. Of course, you can also look into this room and see some of the many trails. This is the Santa Fe Trail, and it left deep ruts in parts of Kansas. In the upper left is Highway 50. The dark curved line is the South Canal. So this is what the original highway system would have looked like through Kansas here. This is what that would have looked like at the time as a train of wagons moved through in around 1844. You can see all of the Americans arriving. They are anxiously trying to get to Santa Fe, which you can see is already established behind them. In fact, setting the context for some of Dodge City's infamy is that Santa Fe Trail. You can see that many people would start out over here in the Missouri area, and they would come through Kansas. They would dip down to the Dodge City area, and then they would go across and either split into Colorado or dip down through the tiniest piece of Oklahoma and into New Mexico. Now, much like many of the other trail knowledge that we have from the Oregon Trail and places like that, this was not an easy feat. It was very much so a grind to get from one place to the next. Transportation was much different at that point than it is now. And I can tell you this, I drove about 4 hours to get to this location today, and I was going through farmland, just farmland, and there wasn't a lot out there. So can you imagine these people had to bring everything with them because that same 4-hour trek would have been days and days of travel in one of these guys. But along the way, we also learned that the Santa Fe Trail wasn't so much just a trail of getting from one place to the next for immigration. It was actually not so much thought to be a place where you were looking for a new home. It was more so that you could follow the trail of commerce. It is compared to the Oregon, California, and Utah routes, only in that it was an extensive journey. However, there were a lot of other things that went along with this one. Unlike those other ones, women and children really didn't do this one very much. It was mostly men, and they were trying to get to Santa Fe. Santa Fe had a lot of different opportunities there, and the railroad coming there made it even more so. It was a hub for commerce, and so a commitment to going to Santa Fe meant you were going to do something better for yourself to make a little bit of that bread. You know what I'm talking about? So this was a very different excursion. So packing was even different. Even though they would bring all their supplies, it was usually not so much that they were bringing their whole home with them like they were on the Oregon Trail. They weren't planning on settling there forever, just kind of taking this as kind of like a back and forth route to some success. A freight wagon like this one would have weighed about 6,000 pounds. And inside of this wagon, they would have brought everything that they wanted to with them. This could have included a lot of different things for trade or for sale also. So instead of a bed, you might have extra cloth. Instead of having a pillow to lay your head on, you might actually carry more ammo. You may have more furs. You may even have beads to do trades, things like that. But not so much like a living room setup. Nope, no nice armoires, no trunks filled with clothes, no signs of just joy from children laughing and playing with their toys. This was progress, and this was work. Now, along the way, of course, again, we look back to the Plains people. And as the Plains people were still in this area, they were having people literally go through their homes and kind of storm through their villages in these massive commerce-seeking 6,000-pound wagons. And so a lot of treaties had to be made. Now, the best person I've ever seen illustrate this was actually a teacher that I had, and they said that a treaty wasn't necessarily an agreement that it was going to be everything roses and sunshine. It just meant that one group said, hey, we won't mess with you, and the other group said, hey, we won't mess with you, and we can coexist. And basically that was it. And so a lot of times these treaties, though very elaborate and lots of terms involved, ended up being broken because someone would decide that that they wanted to take a little bit extra of the pie. And because of that, it would cause conflict. So as we go through here and we learn a little bit more, we now move into this tent area, which is raising a ruckus. Yeah. I think you can see where this is going. But before we do, this is a mock-up of the general store. Now, they do have a general store on property also, so we're going to go check that out in a few minutes. But inside these windows, you can see a few of the things that the general store might have held, including books and guns and tobacco and whiskey and pots and pans. And then we have this fun fact thing. You can actually turn this and see a few fun facts. Right here, for example, it says 4,725 in 1 year. That was the average number of gallons of whiskey consumed in Dodge City. Whiskey, women, guns, and groceries. This is what this next section is about. But before we move into this area, remember guys, there's tons of information here. And I'm just sharing a few of the bullet points so you all can learn a little bit more about what to expect when you come here, but definitely put this on your list. This is so well done. The murals on the walls are amazing, and the historic photos and references are so good. It really puts into context this time frame and also this place. Oh, very interesting. This is a bar, and we can pull up a seat at the bar, and apparently we can raise this shot glass. Yep, it says here we can take a shot to learn about George Hoover.
Hello, welcome to Hoover's Saloon, finest watering hole in Buffalo City. It's actually the only one, but it's definitely the finest. We offer any libation you could possibly wish for, so long as it's whiskey.
That is super cool. Now, the story goes that they stopped selling alcohol because people were just consuming so much in Fort Dodge, which is Dodge City. So this man over here was an entrepreneur. He took his wagon wheel, very similar to that one that we looked at a while ago, and figured out how far it needed to go to reach 5 miles outside of the city bounds. The reason why is because alcohol sales couldn't happen within 5 miles of the fort. So he went 1 foot outside of that 5-mile boundary and set up shop. But George Hoover here wasn't finished with that. In fact, he had bigger plans and aspirations. Even though he had found a way that he could sell a lot of alcohol, he wasn't making a ton of money on that. So he was taking that money and reinvesting it into other things. And later in his life, he became known as the man who did a lot of things here in this area, including helping start one of the banks. Of course, with some of these communities came a lot of really interesting things, and part of those are what made Dodge City have the name that is so infamous even today. Soiled doves, dance hall girls, gambling, all of these things plagued this area. And you might think that the men had capitalized on that the most, but in fact, some of the early women to this area, because they had to be so tough to make it, actually were spearheading the market in some of these ill repute locations, including this woman right here, Molly Whitecamp. She was one of the earliest brothel owners in this area, and you can learn a little bit more about her and the saloons right here. Now, there was a ton of lawlessness in this area, and the city quickly started to boom from what was just a stationary fort with tents to full-on businesses, boardwalks, and lined streets. And as it did, of course, that brought in a lot of money, but also a lot of challenges. And because of that challenge, you started to see a lot more interesting things popping up. Now, as we followed some of the mini stories of the Wild West, including Tombstone and OK Corral, things like that, you've seen several of these stories play out in other locations. But Dodge City had their fair share too. Definitely, they had their fair share. It was said that Dodge City was born of a barrel of whiskey, and as it continued to grow, these are some of the things that started to pop up along the way. A saloon and a general store, a hotel, a stable, a blacksmith, a drugstore, a clothing store, a hardware store, and even a school. And despite the fact that there was a lot of lawlessness and unruly behavior, a church. Now, this display is another one of the interactive displays, so as you move along through each one of these, it will actually light up the photos so you can get a better glimpse at what it looked like in a bit better quality. It's pretty neat because you can read about it here, then you can move on to the next one. And there you go. Here's a pretty fascinating did you know? Did you know that a .44 Winchester cartridge cost a dime? It also was a dime for a 1-ounce whiskey pour. Someone low on cash might be able to coax the barkeep to swap a cartridge for a whiskey, and the term shot was born. Now, Dodge City sat at the center of buffalo hunting, and during the 1870s boom, you saw a lot more buffalo coming through this area, many times already previously shot, of course. So, in this next room, we're going to learn about the rumble on the prairie, which has to do with the buffalo. Of course, we already discussed how the Plains Indians would capitalize and use the buffalo, and they would use every single piece of it. But that wasn't always the case with buffalo hunters who would come through the area. So in this next room, there's actually a video that I can't show you, so you're gonna have to come and watch it. But there's also some other information, so let's go check it out. This is a bison pelt, and this was one of the most abundant grazing animals in North America until it was nearly hunted to extinction in the 1880s. It is here that we learn a little bit more about why the hunting of the buffalo impacted the American Indians so much. And you can see here many of the other artifacts and items that are included in this display. See, the Native Americans used the bison for things. They needed it. They coexisted with the creature. They didn't overhunt. They only got what they needed. But whenever settlers came in and just started plowing down all of these buffalo, it started to greatly affect the tribes that were already in this area for thousands of years. In fact, it is said here that wiping out the buffalo did something that the military itself could not do. It took away the food source and the way of life for the Plains people. And by doing that, it impaired them, it crippled them, and it started to wipe them out. They would have to go other places. Many times that did not work out. Many times they became combative and would fire back on these hunting squads because they were seeing that they were depleting the land. And so here we learn a little bit more about that and why this all happened and why many of the conflicts began to start arising. And then in front of me, it's one of the saddest sights that I've seen time and time again. This photo, believe it or not, is all bison. Just to give you a context in a little bit better form, this is what this mound looked like. It says here that just as Dodge City had been the center of the buffalo hide market, it also became the center for the bones. Bone pickers earned $4 to $8 a ton. It is said that over 8 million tons of bones were shipped out of the Dodge City area at one point during 1883. That's how many buffalo were just mowed down in this area. That could have been enough to feed tribes for decades, but instead it was just a sport. Get rid of it. It's fine. For this reason, the white men became known as the White Devil. And these are 3 of the stories of some of those hunters. In fact, as you read through these are the stories of predators of the bison. Now, some of these men hunted because of sport. Some of them hunted for financial gain, and some truly did want to cripple the Plains people. And so they all had different motives, but they all came with guns, and they did their job very efficiently and very quickly. And because of that, that is why back here we learned that they nearly went extinct. Every time I see one now out in the field, I'm always so giddy because I know that I'm looking at something that might not have been. It could have been wiped completely off our planet. We would have never known anything of it if it weren't for these photos. But fortunately, that wasn't the case. Some of these faces are pretty familiar. These are the Mastersons. You've heard of them. There's been several Westerns made after them. Now, just past that display, we move into the travel section, and this talks about the differences between a stagecoach and rail travel. And it was a big difference, let me tell you. As railroads moved in, it became more efficient, and so ultimately, stagecoaches started to fade more and more into the distance. But there's some fun facts over here as to just putting it into like brass tacks as to exactly how much of a difference it really was when it came to efficiency for passengers and also for shipping. Here we find a side-by-side comparison of the stagecoach versus the train, and I think you can see there's a lot of big, huge advantages. A train could go 300 miles a day versus only 50 in a stage, and the average cost was 15 cents per mile versus 5 cents per mile for first class, so you could get an upgraded experience and still pay less. Not to mention, a train could haul 100 people versus only 8 on a stagecoach. And then came the rules. These are the rules for riding in a stagecoach, including you can't spit chewing tobacco into the wind. I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? But here's one that might not. Don't snore. How can you like regulate that? You just stay awake? I don't know. Also, don't oil or grease your hair. Dust and dirt will stick to it. So some of these are just like common sense things, but some of them are kind of interesting. So this is a fun one to look at. Now here you can actually get inside and take a selfie in a stagecoach. And so that's kind of cool. Oh guys, we followed the track and now we get to push the button. Ooh. What happens though? Oh, there it is up top. Of course, after you move past the stage area, then you get to the train area and you can be a conductor and learn about the Harvey houses and things like that. And I really like this because it does tie together a ton of different stops that we've made here on the channel before. In fact, the Harvey houses, we learned a lot about whenever we were stopping off in Winslow, Arizona at the little local museum there. It was quite fascinating to see how they had one of the longest standing Harvey houses. But now we get to see what it would have been like to be a Harvey girl. Very cool. In fact, right here in Dodge City, they had a Harvey house also. And if you listen to the woman who was just speaking, she talks about how the Harvey girls were supposed to be like a little touch of home. They were supposed to remind you of the people that you know from before you came out this way. They were supposed to be a warm, welcoming face. They were supposed to provide lots of comforts, including warm and delicious food and great conversation, but not be like the girls that were in the houses of ill repute. This right here is the man himself who created Harvey houses. This is Fred Harvey, and he lived between 1835 and 1901, and he built his reputation with hotels, restaurants, dining cars, all of which that catered to the passengers of the railway. We now move up the trail with cattle and cowboys, and right here we immediately see that there are millions of cattle and hundreds of cowboys who pass through Dodge City. Now, in modern terms, a cowboy would make about $1,000 a month doing his job, and that would be moving the cattle from point A to point B. This would be several months, so they'd basically be signing up for a limited engagement, but that was pretty decent money at that time. However, it was also a lot of hard work, and you had to really trust the people you were working with because you had to work in unison to make sure you made it from point A to point B safely. Now, the job of those cowboys was pretty rough as they would go on the trails. In fact, they would use a variety of different tools just to maintain everything as going. These are some of those. The trails themselves were riddled with rustlers and thieves who would try to steal all of the herd, and then also predators that would come and try to isolate the weak in the herd at night. It was up to the cowboys to make sure that none of this happened. Brands became more and more important at this time because being able to mark the cattle would eliminate some of the rustlers from being able to steal things and call them their own. Here you can see a few of the different cattle brands and also a little bit of information about what it would take to create your own brand. And I really love this because this book, it just looks like it's aged, but at the same time it's brand new. It's absolutely just super cool and filled with great information. Of course, brands themselves look about like this, and they would heat them over a fire until they had gotten to a very hot point, and then they would place them on the flesh of the cow and it would scab over, and that's what would create the brand. Now, I've spoken on some of the more popular trails previous because the Chisholm Trail runs right through where my hometown is, but here you can see a couple of the others, the Shawnee Trail, the Western Trail, and the Goodnight Loving Trail. Now, when we watch Westerns, a lot of times we see the white hat cowboy. He's the good guy. He's usually a white man. But did you know that the first cowboys, many of them were African American, Native American, or Spanish? In fact, here you can learn a little bit more about that. And there have been a version of cowboy in many other countries previous to the cowboys that we more traditionally know now as like the good old American cowboys. And so I think it's really nice to know that they've covered that a lot of the earliest cowboys, even here in the United States, were multicultural. And it's kind of cool because it would explain a lot of some of the interesting things that I've seen along the way. Much like the brands, the barbed wire also had a very specific and unique look from place to place. In fact, you can find all sorts of different kinds of barbed wire right here at the Dodge City Museum, but also you can find what the patent name was on each of these. Before barbed wire, it was harder to establish pieces of land for individual ownership. And so this really helped people to not only establish their ownership, but also keep their particular cattle in their particular land. And so that was very good. However, that also brought about the bad guys once again who would just snip the wires and pull everything out. But because they actually had established a boundary, some laws were put into place to protect people who had ranches and farms who were in fact, sectioning off like they should have. So that's kind of an interesting thing that we'll dive into possibly at the Barbed Wire Museum in the future. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Now, along the way, a lot of things started changing when they started to kind of section their land, and they needed to also establish water. Windmills were a major source of that. So here you can learn about how windmills really impacted the Dodge City landscape and moved us right into what we call the heyday. When you come to a place, make sure you look both up, down, and all around, because up top here we have some of the original pieces that were rescued from the buildings in order to preserve them. And I think that this is a piece that is beyond measure on the worth and value of it. A lot of places lose their history over time and buildings are demolished, and then they don't get an opportunity to keep things like this. So the fact that Dodge City has preserved this piece of their very history from the beginning is absolutely spectacular, and it's definitely a marvel to see. It brings about that sense of nostalgia for us visiting, but at the same time, this piece of history is irreplaceable. As Dodge City began to grow in popularity, it went from a Wild West, no rules kind of town to a place that a lot of people wanted to be. It was a hub, it was a center, and it became a place where a lot of people, especially those who were financially upwardly mobile, started to flock to. They wanted to come to this gateway to the West. They wanted to show off their power, and a boom began. I once read that you can tell a lot about a society by their women's clothing at that time, and you can definitely do that with these fine, intricate lace corsets that would snatch even the biggest of waist in, but also would weigh like 40 pounds. Tiny little details in beadwork, and also the prints and patterns that they would use. This was a time where Dodge City really saw the push from the East as very wealthy women were starting to emerge. And it was no longer just houses of ill repute and saloons. You were now seeing society come to Dodge City. Of course, anytime that society comes, you have to be able to protect it. So law enforcement was on the rise. As we come into this region, we get to learn if people were outlaws or lawmen. It tells the story of each and every one of them. Not to mention the law versus the lawlessness. It was a fine line sometimes between the two. Interaction does not stop. You can actually choose if someone was an outlaw or a hero, guilty or innocent. In fact, here you'll find some of the names most synonymous with some of our other adventures. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson. You also have James Kelly and Luke Short. Some very interesting names that have been on the silver screen time and time again. But they actually existed, and they were right here in Dodge City. Now we are moving into the rich and rowdy festive cowboy. And wow, he looks like he's having a good time at the saloon. In fact, it's here that we have another interactive exhibit. This time we get to push a button. Let's do it. Here we go. Well, that was pretty interesting. It tells the story of Dora Hand. Now, Dora Hand had a short-lived life. She ended up passing away, but not before she couldn't make her name here in the Dodge City area. Now this is Dora, and she was actually well trained as a singer in Boston before coming out this way. It was kind of an interesting story because she became a quick favorite and had a weekly pay of $75, which was unheard of at the time. Now initially, because she sang in front of the menfolk, a lot of women scowled at her and scoffed, but eventually she was able to sing in the local church. She was a very generous woman, and because she had a lot more money coming in than many, she was very generous with that money. In fact, it was said that she often would feed those who were less fortunate or who could not afford to purchase food themselves. And so she could be seen doing that very frequently here in the streets of Dodge City in the mornings. Also, there's an interaction here. You are to spin the wheel and find out how you would do here in Dodge City. I'm thinking it's kind of rough and tumble. I don't think I'm gonna do so well, but let's see. Big money, big money, big money, big money. Oh. Nothing. It's a question mark. How would I have done? Let's see, what would the next one be? Oh, bust. But why did I bust? The economy slumped and I had to sell my ranch. Now looking on at this bar right here, you might think, okay, it's just all bars and parties here in Kansas. But in fact, in 1881, Kansas banned the making and selling of alcohol. A lot of saloons had to close their doors, but Dodge City ignored the law. See, Dodge City figured out how to skirt around a few things, and in their time, they knew what a good loophole was. So they would exploit the loopholes and just take advantage of the fact that there was very lax law enforcement. Not to mention, they would fight against it and just go ahead and pay fines because they were raking in the dough. They didn't seem to mind whatsoever. So, seeing this, you actually can see this was a very popular place. And people knew that it was still doing this, so of course, even more people came. However, not everything was roses and sunshine here in Dodge City. In fact, being on the plains the way that it was susceptible to a lot of problems, including blizzards and fires. The Great Blizzard of 1886 is featured here, and you can see that that is a full-size train, and it is almost completely under snow. A closer look shows that people are standing on dunes upon dunes of snow, and you might think, oh, Kansas gets a good snow. But this was actually after an unseasonably warm December. And on New Year's Eve, while everyone was celebrating the coming of the new year, snow began to fall. Howling winds swept through. Snowdrifts that were several feet high stranded travelers. The hotels and homes were packed with those who were in transit. Ranchers recorded record losses. In fact, 25 to 90% of the livestock did not survive this storm. And so a recession began in the Dodge City area. But it would not be the first, nor would it be the last. Fires. Fires would ravage Dodge City not once, not even twice, but 8 separate fires destroyed dozens of buildings between 1885 and 1886. This included Kelly's Opera House, grocery stores, dry goods stores, a bank, a blacksmith shop, and even the newspaper office. Following these, quarantine, prohibition, all of these things just continued to stack the odds against Dodge City. But Dodge City continued to rebuild, and they weren't willing to give up. Now, many of the places that we have been kind of faded into the distance when they were faced with the same kinds of issues. But Dodge City instead dug in and showed that they had spirit and weren't willing to let go of what was and what could be. As we move into this room, we learn more about the founders of Dodge City. And each person has their own individual interactive display, but also a little placard beside it. This is a cool room. A familiar face, Mr. Wyatt Earp. He was a famed lawman and gunfighter. He helped to keep the peace in the days when Dodge City was full of all the raucous cowboys. But there are other photos around this room that are just fascinating, and I encourage you to take a few moments to really look at them. You can see in their eyes the pride for Dodge City. And also, through these things, you can kind of get a concept of the time. Now, as we move out this door over here, we get to go to the outdoor exhibits. The indoor exhibits have been fabulous, though, and this is definitely one of the best Western museums I've seen in a bit. It says here, you've learned the story of Dodge City. Now step outside and live it. So, I'm gonna put on some sunglasses and let's do this. Let's go. Oh, wow, guys. Oh, this is cool. Now you might notice all these forward-facing benches. That's because they actually do programs here also in this very area. So check their schedule and see if they're doing one when you come. After coming outside, we are first going to look at the Fort Dodge Jail. It was built in 1865, and this is actually the original building that we're about to look at. Now, over time, obviously there have been improvements made to the property, but this building has been here since like the beginning, so it's pretty cool. And it tells you a little bit more about this. This was actually something that would have been considered to be kind of like a county jail. So, right here, tiny building. This should be interesting. Few thoughts. It's a hot day here in Dodge City. And in there, it's even hotter. Like there's not much circulation at all that comes through here. And these rooms are barely long enough for you to like lay down. And then there's like a hole in the floor. That's it. No frills. It isn't anything like the current prison system. This was much more inhumane. Now, a lot of different places on property have these little signs that just basically tell you how someone lived here and then also what happened to them. So these are kind of interesting to find kind of along the way. Oh wow, guys, look at this. These are such cool displays. I will say this is not what I expected at all coming into this building, but I'm so pleasantly surprised. This display right here talks about Hollywood and the Wild West. And it says that you can begin with Eddie Foy and Jim Thompson, traveling comedians and vaudeville performers. They moved up and down the railroad lines, and they played the early cowtowns. It goes on to say that Hollywood's always been pretty obsessed with the culture of this particular area, and the cowboys have always been something that have popped up on the silver screen. And in fact, Dodge City and its legacy was portrayed in a lot of episodes of Gunsmoke, and I think that that's just kind of neat. But there are so many other movies that have referenced Dodge City and its past that it is just impossible to count them all. There's just so many. But here we can see a few of those references. This neon boot actually sat on top of the original Boot Hill building in 1947. Here are some of the references to this area, including this by Earl Flynn, Dodge City. Of course, there is Gunsmoke's Festus. They've also had a Cowboy Culture Award for Western Movies and Television for Dennis Weaver in here. So many people. Wow, this is a very cool display of Hollywood history. But this table might be some of my favorite information. This has some of the story of Gunsmoke and what differentiated it from some of the other westerns at the time. Of course, Dodge City and the Marshals have been hand in hand throughout their history. And here you learn a little bit more about the last U.S. Marshal of Dodge City, which was Kenneth Raymond House. He was born in 1915 in Kentucky, and he came to Dodge City after making the acquaintance with the city mayor. Now, believe it or not, he actually served with the Marshal Service until the 1990s, well into his twilight years. And he was very passionate about many things that had to do with this very area, the Boot Hill area. And so it's kind of neat to be able to learn a little bit more, but also see some of the things that would have been in his office and some of the artifacts there. Now, along this wall, we get to see a glimpse of some of the different things that they have had here at the museum and along the Front Street area. And there's so many historic photos. Just take some time and look at these. There's some great ones in here. It also tells you a story for some of the original artifacts. For example, this buffalo was actually put on display here and remained here until eventually it led to deterioration and had to be removed. This is what the original Boot Hill Museum looked like. It had its own unique history, just like all of the people that it's spoken about. From the first person that was buried on the hill in 1935 to when the sign was raised proclaiming it to be the Boot Hill Cemetery to present day, the current renovations even that are happening. This place has a history that is wild. In fact, it goes on to say that even the people who chose this to be the Boot Hill Cemetery area had no idea of the impact that it would have even to this day. People come here from around the world world, not just around the United States, but around the world, to see the stories and the legends of some of the biggest cowboys in the West. Oh, this is neat, guys. This is super neat in here. It says not many cultures can capture the imagination of the people all around the world like the cowboys have. Following the Civil War, a severe drought along with oversized herds left the cattle market completely burned out. Cattle barons soon realized that herding large numbers of longhorns across the prairie to Kansas didn't meet the demand anymore. Railroads became the only way that they would move cattle going forth, and cattle were soon being shipped east and west. But the day of the cowboy still remains, and along this wall you can see the Kansas Cowboy Hall of Fame. There's several faces here who have done many things: entertainers, artists, historians, working cowboys, rodeos, people who have ranches, cattlemen. It's a fascinating wall, and the more that you learn about each one of these people, the more you see the faces of the people who are your next door neighbor, the people who have lived in this area. In fact, as you travel through this entire gallery, you'll find more people that are actually from this area displayed on these walls. Cowboys are the backbone of society and community, and these guys, well, they do the hard work that nobody else wants to do, and they do it with a smile and a sense of accomplishment. Okay, through this little outdoor tunnel we go, and we have made it to the Boothill Cemetery. Again, this is the Boothill Cemetery, and though the scenery around it has vastly changed since it was originally developed, it's kind of fascinating to read all the signs. Alexander Cole was hanged in 1876, and that's all they know about him. Ed Williams, on the other hand, was along with Charles Hill, and they were both killed in a dance hall by the Dodge City Vigilante Committee. Edward Hurley here was placed here on January 17th, 1873. And there's a quote that was placed in the Kansas Daily Commonwealth out of Topeka about what happened. 5 buffalo hunters that were unnamed were laid to rest here in February 1873. And it says here again from the Kansas Daily Commonwealth out of Topeka, information comes to us from Dodge City this morning that 5 buffalo hunters were brought into town frozen to death. George Hoy, August 21st, 1871. He was one of the few men Wyatt Earp killed in the line of duty. Charlie Morehouse, December 5th, 1872. He was a gambler by trade, killed by a stray bullet in a Dodge City saloon. Now, why did they call it Boothill though? Well, there's a lot of different things that kind of have been passed around from one Boothill to the next. But one of the things I learned in Tombstone was that part of the reason why they called places like this a Boothill was because they'd leave boots sticking up out of the ground. And here you can see these little concrete boots sticking up out of the ground. Now, as we look on though, there is a question that is posed before us here. Is this a real cemetery? Yes. Are there any bodies still buried here? Perhaps. They're not going to commit to yes or no, but Boothill has changed quite a bit since its original inception. In fact, here is a photo of the funeral of the mayor, Alonzo Webster, who we learned about inside, and that's what Boothill looked like at that time. Now, this was kind of a short-lived cemetery, however, so a lot of the people who were said to be put in this particular cemetery were very early into the Dodge City days. In fact, a new cemetery was established, and it was called Prairie Grove, and that was in about 1879. So you can go out there also and see some of the historic graves. Some of the people who were buried in this one were actually moved to that one too from historic records. And so it's kind of interesting to kind of put the pieces together of this weird little puzzle we call Boothill. We are now going to enter into the Front Street replica of the 1870s Front Street. This was originally erected in 1958. And we're going to start off with the general store. Looks to be open. Let's go. Okay guys, right next to the general store we have the saloon. Now, the bartender's in there having a conversation about some of the cool things that they do here at Dodge City, and I think that it's just fascinating. Instead of just doing like the generic bang bang gunfight, they actually have actual productions here that they do. And in fact, the building that they're working on right now, they're going to be doing a dinner show that you can come in, you can sit down, you can watch an entire show that would have been themed for the time, very similar to what would have been in a saloon like the one we just walked through. Now, this place has so many little pieces that are attention to detail oriented. The trim work, the various styles of flooring, even the creak that you find as you walk through. And he was just saying that when you see them fist fight, they are actually throwing those punches. Now, just past the saloon, you can find a variety of different things, such as this. This would be like a storefront here. You can see that there's like a tailor. And then as we continue going, there's a bit more history right through the store. What about a barber shop? They have one of those too. Chairs, they got them. Shaving containers, yep, those too. Even razors and razor straps. Now move into guns that won the West. And it's always fascinating to me to come to a museum like this and find out what exactly they were using. And one name reigns supreme always: Winchester. But this section is also broken down into the different kinds of guns that various people would have used, from the gamblers who wanted something that were more concealed so that they could be under the table, to the lawmen who would chase after the gamblers, and also the bad guys. You can find it all here in this. Of course, in the initial gallery, we learned a little bit more about the Buffalo Hunters, but these were some of the guns that might have been tools of their trade. And over here with the gamblers, yeah, these guys are small, especially that one that you could put under your shirt sleeve right there. Anywhere there are lawmen, there are always outlaws, and here you not only find the guns that some of these outlaws might have carried, but also a depiction of what it would have been to have a gunfight here in Dodge City. And of course, with each of these displays, you find out a little bit more through the plaques below. And this one actually clarifies that a typical gunfight was not the gunfight that you see in the Wild West movies. It was very different. And all these handcuffs. Wow. But this is something right here. Look at that. They have iron gloves. Those are actually called McKenzie mitts, and they were invented in 1925 right here in Kansas. Inside this display, we see the Rice Brothers saddlery, and you find all sorts of different leather goods that could have been used for working with your horses. But also there's a little touch display over here, especially good for the kiddos so that they can kind of get an idea of what this would have been like. And then we move into this room, which talks about Frederick Zimmerman. He was a gunsmith and also did hardware sales. Again, another kind of interactive display. This just shows you the various kinds of locks and latches, and also tells you about some of the tools that they would have used at the time. I will say it's pretty neat to come in here and see all of the moving working pieces that would have gone into what these businesses were at the time. Oh no, guys. It's another jail. Let's go inside and see who's in this one. Apparently, the very bars that we just walked through once were actually located at South 2nd Street, and it was at the City Hall building, which was used until 1929. They have been restored and brought here, of course, for display. And there's a bit more information here about some of the lawmen and also some of the not-so-savory gentlemen who were from this area. This gun below belonged to Dave Mather. It is a Colt Army model, 1860, cap and ball 44 cal, and more than 200,000 of these were actually manufactured at one point. A few fun facts adorn this wall, like for example, right here, which famous Dodge City lawman had the middle name Barry Stapp? Guess what? It was Wyatt Earp. And this is everything. This is actually a court affidavit. The Scarlet Ladies of Dodge City were actually quarrelsome, and because of that, they had this as a result of one of those quarrels. Did you know that many of the prostitutes in this area actually handed out business cards? Yep, they sure did. We just learned that here. Again, so many pieces of cool information, guys, and each room reveals more and more of the story of what made this town unique. And so, even though I'm just sharing a few of the bullet points, I hope that you will come here and pick up on a few more of these, because it's really epic. Of course, one of my favorite places always is the printing press. I used to work in the media, and because of that, I have some printing knowledge, but never did I have to experience typography quite like this. Now we have another interesting touch screen right here. It tells us more about the gambling here in Dodge City. And you can click away and see various things. So let's touch the screen and see what happens. It tells us a little bit about each one of the games that were super popular at the time, as well as a brief. We'll go to Spanish Monte right here. And here we go. It's going to explain Spanish Monte. Did you know at one point there was actually a Dodge City cowboy band? Yeah. In fact, many of these instruments would have been included in this band, and they had a lot of really great engagement from the community. In fact, Dodge City was known for all of the entertainment it provided. Now, I think you can see from the interior of this building, the storefronts on the outside and the storefronts on the inside all have many stories to tell, as each place that you go tells you a little bit more about one of the many businesses inside. Of course, this one is one that you hope you never have to go to, but at the same time was one of the most important ones in the entire community. Things were very different then. And you can see here there's a variety of different styles of caskets, many of which have glass faces on them, which is absolutely creepy. Did you know that there was a proper way to mourn? Yeah, we learned about that in Oklahoma. In fact, Oklahoma had a display at one of the museums that we went to that talked about the time frame for mourning for everyone in the family, from a dad who had lost his wife, or a dad who had lost his parents, to a wife who had lost her husband or her parents or her children, to the children themselves. There are different protocols for each and every one of them, and you're expected to follow those, and if you didn't, you were looked on very badly. And now we move into the bank. The bank is elaborate. It is adorned with very intricate designs, and it has so many interesting details. Like the teller window itself has a nice granite inlay, and then this beautiful wood. But it also has this intricate ironwork to make sure that no one can get back to the safe. Now, in its prime, this is what the bank here would have looked like. This was actually the Ness County Bank. In comparison, the post office was a pretty stripped down version. It didn't have to be elaborate. It didn't have to impress. In comparison, this is what the post office window would have looked like. Have you ever wondered why people don't smile in photos? Well, that's a question that Boot Hill Museum gets asked very frequently, actually, so they have made an entire plaque to talk about it. It says that life was hard. People lacked the creature comforts that we have today. They also had bad teeth. They also were thought that smiling made them look silly. Formal photographs were just that, they were formal. Long exposure times were another reason. The time the camera needed to take a picture made it just as important for the subject to stay still as possible. So they wouldn't want to move because they didn't want to make it blurry. In fact, can you sit still for 1 minute? Now today, I have a camera that's this size and then a camera that's a bit larger that's handheld. But look at this. These were the cameras of the day. They had to process a lot differently than the cameras we have now. Now I can point, shoot, move on, make facial expressions, be silly, do whatever, and it's fine. But if I would have had to wait for one of these guys, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. I mean, obvious, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now because I couldn't lug that thing around like, ooh. But at the same time, it kind of makes you appreciate the modern technology and the smaller and smaller that it gets. Yes, it does. They also have a very epic storefront right here that talks about the history of photography. And they actually have an area, I think, where you can get your photos taken here as well. And I will say this area with the photography is fantastic. It shows you what the original storefronts on the street looked like. And you can compare that to what it looks like here on the recreation. It's just really, really epic. But within each of these, you'll notice that there is a number, and there is a correlating number on the door right over here that tells you what it is, why it's important, what you're looking at, and some brain wrinkles for you to take with you on the road. I have had a great time here in Dodge City sharing with you the Boot Hill Museum, and I hope you've enjoyed coming with me. This is a one-of-a-kind, unique experience that you aren't going to want to miss. Not to mention, if you followed along on many of my other adventures, this one ties some of them together, and you know, it's always fun to get some new brain wrinkles. Remember guys, we're not here for a long time, but we are here for a good time, and today was definitely that. We saw something cool, we picked up some curds, and now we're going to hit the road to our next adventure. Bye guys!